My name is Carl Quill, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. Today we're talking with Eamonn Glass, founder of Maggie's Farm Incorporated. Eamonn has had a pretty diverse career, both in and out of games, most recently an 11-year stint at Electronic Arts. As he was considering what he wanted to do next, really searching for his next purpose for his career, wildfires in British Columbia claimed the town of Lytton, completely wiping it off the map. He had been a regular visitor of Lytton, and with his family often going there to camp each summer. This sparked a focus on building games to help educate and address the need for change in wildfire management, awareness, and prevention. And really was the start of his founding journey. From there, Eamonn has had his shares of ups and downs dealing with the realities of founding, which he shares with us. Let's jump in. The way I normally like to start the conversation and where we kick off is, for me, there was this moment where I went from I'm thinking about starting a company to no, I'm absolutely starting a company. And I sort of emotionally and mentally committed. And I sort of remember that moment that the mindset shifted. And I'm curious if you could go take us back and talk about what led up to you founding your studio and what sort of pushed you over the edge that helped you go, okay, maybe I do this too. No, I'm definitely doing this.
Yeah, I think a little bit of, context around that, from my, I guess like life journey that led to an entrepreneurial journey. I think that to found a game studio or do anything entrepreneurial, it's got to be grounded in like absolutely loving that thing. And, whether it's a love of money or a love of making jewelry or a love of making indie games, because you certainly don't go into making indie games for the money.
No.
So, my love affair with games started, pretty close to the beginning of the industry. Like I fell in love with games on the Atari 2600 and then Atari was a big part of my formative years. Then had an Atari 1040 STE and a couple of buddies had them as well. And I remember the first like really intense long gaming session I had was probably about 14 hours long with a buddy where we connected our two Atari 1040s with a null modem cable, which was the equivalent of like a LAN party back then. And we played a game called Falcon, flight simulator, nonstop, like just all night long. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, if like computers around the world could connect to each other, this is going to revolutionize entertainment. Because it was before the, concept of the internet being widespread. And I just absolutely loved that whole concept. And then, played Baldur's Gate, fell in love with like, oh my gosh, there's like whole worlds in here. So love affair with games started really, really early. And I think that's like the baseline for doing something entrepreneurial. You've got to love it. And so then I thought a bit about this in terms of like the life journey that leads to founding a studio. And I think that there's this notion of tenacity. To start an entrepreneurial journey, you've got to be tenacious. You have to have some talent. And then there's like some tipping point event that occurs where you go, okay, I'm actually going to do this. So if I like break those down and look at that, tenacity, talent, and tipping point from my experience, being able to go back to university in my 30s and do a master's degree. And that was you know, a kind of a tenacity thing as well, where it was like, I really want to be more educated and more equipped with skills. So, um, that was some of the makeup of being pretty tenacious and being willing to, take risks and pursue things that were challenging. But my love of games led me to work on a mod for Battlefield 2 called Project Reality. And that led to that love of games, led me to a situation where I got involved with this mod that a really amazing guy named Noel Talk had started. And Noel and I hit it off really well. He said, look, we're thinking we're going to shut down this mod. Like, we've been at it for a while now, about a year. We're not really making any progress, and we think we're going to shut it down. I said, you know what? Let me take it over and run this and see if we can get it on the right trajectory. And 20 years later, people still play it. And, I realized, okay, I've got some talent for leading teams and making games, that maybe I can turn this love of games into a career. And then I ended up at EA through a, again, kind of odd roundabout journey. I worked in the Oracle Corporation. I ended up at EA in a role as hired as a project manager, and had an amazing career there. And for the first few years I was there, I was kind of constantly learning. I was having a big impact on the organization. But then, I got to a stage where, for me to advance in the direction of, designing and making games more than being a project manager, that realistically the path forward for me there was to move to Sweden. And it wasn't in the cards for me to do that. We had young kids, they were in school, friends. And so I made a kind of a turn in the career at EA, where I started to focus on building technology. And I just found I didn't enjoy it near as much. Like, I did it for a few years, but it was like, this is not making games. This isn't the passion that I have. And then, going back to this like tipping point thing, I had a personal experience that made me really think about, my role in the world, and how I could, think about the legacy I leave as a human being. Our family has been camping up in Lytton, BC for 20 years. Got a little tiny campsite on a lake up there. And I'm not sure if you are familiar with this, if you recall, but in 2021, Lytton was burned to the ground by wildfires, like literally wiped off the face of the earth. And, the town was like, kind of something you take for granted that it'll be there. It was, when we were up camping and I wanted to, say, watch a sporting event, we'd go to the Lytton Hotel and, spent a lot of time hanging out there. They have a farmer's market on the weekends, always really cool. And I had heard about the wildfires, obviously, and we'd stayed away from Lytton because we didn't want to, be gawking at people's misery. But we did go back to Lytton in 2023 and, again, stayed away, but thought, okay, let's go take a look at what this looks like. And it was gone, like concrete foundations and nothing on top of them, like gone. And it had a really profound effect on me, like just thinking about how small we are in the world, worried about our 9-to-5 jobs and these other things. And then thinking about like an entire community just like wiped off the face of the earth by wildfire. And, I thought, okay, I love games. I'm pretty stagnant in my career right now. What am I going to do about this? And, that was like the tipping point moment for me, where I decided I'm going to form a studio and make games that educate people in a fun way about wildfires and climate crisis. And it was a few months before kind of getting it sorted out, but that experience of, standing in the ashes of a small town that meant something to us, but obviously meant everything to a community of like 3,000 people that relied on the services in Lytton, was the internal tipping point that said, yeah, I'm doing this.
Yeah, I think like I remember, the news when that wildfire really ripped through that area and you know took out Lytton, and thinking about just how awful that must be, and to have connections up there, and to have sort of seen the before and after. I can imagine it can be a real shift in the world perspective for yourself. Once you really had committed to this idea of like, I'm going to start the studio, I'm going to focus on this idea of trying to create games that bring this perspective and this sort of view into the world to a broader audience. What did you sort of have to realize? Oh, well, if I'm doing this, I'm going to have to learn this and that, and like I have to figure out how to do this other thing, right? Like, what were the big things that you were like, oh, well, I'm committed, but now I have to go on a learning journey?
So I think for me that like I've been a lifelong learner. I don't think there's a year gone by in my life where I haven't done some kind of course or night school or something. So that like learning journey for me was, something I looked forward to. Certainly a steeper hill to climb than I thought. And, I think that the most important thing that needed to be figured out was what game are we making, and get really, really super clear on that. Cause it started for me, some folks go into it like, I've got this amazing idea for a game and this is the game I'm going to make. And obviously that evolves organically over time to some degree. But for me, I started with, I want to have a positive impact on this societal and climate issue. And how can I use games and my love of games and my willingness to, do this stupid thing of starting a small game studio? How can I use that to have a positive impact on society? And so a little bit different in the sense of like that first exploration of, well, what game are we making? Because it started out with, I think I want to make Roblox games and really like reach out to kids and educate kids in this context about climate issues, specifically wildfire. And so I spent, like maybe about 3 months working on Roblox Studio and prototyping some concepts. It's pretty accessible. I'm like dangerously bad at many things, but enough to sort of get a feel for it. But what I came out of that initial like Roblox focused exercise with was that I could not authentically engage in that community. Like I was not a member of the Roblox community. I never would or will be. Like they've done some amazing things where, I played a bunch of games that are like, this is actually a really good game. Doesn't look anything like Roblox. But, when I looked at like what makes games successful on Roblox, I was like, I don't really know. Like, I don't understand this enough to know. And I'm not in that, target demographic. So it felt super inauthentic to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was where it was like, okay, take a step back and like think about what game are we making? What's the best platform to make that game? And then, went through a iterative kind of paper based. So I'm a big, huge lover of paper prototyping and tabletop games, and built out a couple of concepts on like paper prototypes and made some real simple tabletop game versions of those, and eventually landed on, we want to make a small number of player co-op game. So 1 to 5 player co-op, and that Unreal Engine is going to be the best tool choice to do that. But that whole process took about 6 months to figure it out. Then once we'd figured out, okay, that's the way we're going to go, was when we got more serious about co-founding and starting a company and registering the company and all those things. So, really for me, it was the learning of figuring out what game we're making.
So you mentioned that like as you figured out the game you were making, and then you sort of crossed this threshold where you're like, okay, let's get more serious about co-founding and starting a company, all that kind of stuff. Can you speak a little bit about like what like, do you have co-founders? What is that sort of co-founder makeup, and how you found those co-founders along the way?
Yeah. So there are four of us that co-founded the company. We've known each other for between 10 and 30 years. One of the co-founders is my wife. A lot of people are like, "Ooh, how does that go?" And so the thing about that is that we've never not been entrepreneurial partners. That was one of the ways that we originally met. Um, and fell in love and got married was around an entrepreneurial venture that I had at that time. And so that certainly does add some stress and strain. But I think that we've been through a lot together, so we continue to try to figure out how to get through more. And then two other folks that I'd known for ages. One that I met in, going way back in the modding scene when I was leading a mod team, and another that I met at EA, and we had complementary skill sets. And, truthfully, we probably didn't have enough of the conversations that we needed to have. Those came later. But that, initial like 4-founder makeup, we thought was a good mix of skill sets. But one lesson that I learned out of that was we really badly lack a creative director. And there was a gentleman I've known for a long time that I'd hoped we could convince to join us. Our goal was to have 5 founders. I know that sounds like a lot, but that was our goal, was to have a really good blend of skill sets. But we didn't actually secure a creative director as a co-founder, and certainly has been a challenge to work without one. But yeah, the 4-founder makeup is where we landed, and have continued to progress or pursue the dream from there.
When you think about, a lot of times when sort of co-founders come together, and you sort of use that language as you were describing it a little bit, of like thinking about folks as the, like, what role do they bring to the development journey, right? Like, who's an engineer, who's a technical, who's design, who's creative, right? Like that kind of stuff. But often, especially when you have co-founder groups that have known each other for the length of time that you guys have, it's really more about, oh, well, your wife is the pragmatic one, and the fourth person is the one who's an optimist in face of all reality, right? Like in these sort of personality dynamics and strengths and weaknesses that actually create a really healthy working team. And then, of course, they have some amount of like technical skill or discipline skill to actually build a game. I'm curious, when you think about it through that lens, how do you think about that makeup, and what do you personally sort of bring to the table in that makeup? And how do the other co-founders balance out, where are you strong, where they are potentially more weak or have a different viewpoint, and where do they balance perhaps the areas that you're less strong in, or have perhaps more negative tendencies in, right?
So I think that, maybe lots of folks go through this journey, but it's a very humbling journey to start an indie game studio, especially in this macroeconomic climate. And, so for me, I think that I've always had this, like, a strength of orchestration, where it's like, okay, I can get 6, 7, 8, 9 moving parts, and I can keep them coordinated and flowing, keep people inspired, motivated, on target, and keep us moving forward towards a shared goal, and make sure everybody's, clear and inspired, and try to create an environment to get the best out of everybody. But when you're talking about that in like an Oracle Corp environment or an EA environment, that's a valuable skill to have. In an indie studio, it's pretty much useless because there's nobody to orchestrate. It's, very much a roll the sleeves up and get her done kind of environment. So I think for me, the strength that I have hasn't been as applicable as, it had been in other workplace environments. And so the thing that I've learned about myself that is a strength that was a bit of a discovery was I'm a lot more resilient than I thought I was. That, that face of adversity constantly like, okay, this didn't work. Let's try that, whether it's funding or working on specific aspects of the game itself. That like resiliency driven by optimism and just figuring out a way to like stay positive, upbeat, keep other people informed and inspired has been a discovery to a degree of a strength that I didn't really know that I had. And I think that that's helped other folks in that founding group be like, oh my God, I can't believe you are still going after this with the energy that you are still going after this with. So that's, kept me and others going, different way of people orchestrated and motivated and inspired. And, for me, a part of that is just looking at the world around us, right? Like wildfires are not going away, and the impact that they have on society and people is massive. We were going to start doing some promotion in January of this year. It was like, yeah, cool, new year, let's start down this path. And then I was like, whoa, hold on. I do not want to be jumping in on what's going on Los Angeles and be perceived that in some way, shape, or form we are trying to profit off this. So a lot of my motivation to, speak with you has been that this is not a, hey, let's jump in and try and make, money off of this crisis or be perceived to be that way from people that don't know how awful the financials of indie game studios are, that I really wanted to make sure that we thought about and went forward with like, this is the motivation and inspiration for us, is to have some kind of positive impact on this climate issue and on the societal impacts of it, more so than any perception that we were somehow trying to profiteer off this. And that grounding in values has also kept other folks motivated. So other folks on the founding team motivated. So that, it's a different way of that orchestration skill manifesting, but it's had to completely transform from what used to be one of my bigger strengths.
One of the things that I always like to dig into is with a, the larger your co-founding group gets, the more complex sometimes coming to decisions, dealing with disagreements can be, right? Like just inherently with the nature of humans, like the more humans there are involved, the more complex those sorts of conversations can get. So I'm curious, within your co-founder group, how do you guys, agree to make decisions? How do you navigate through that? And how do you deal with the inevitable disagreements that any four people will always disagree somewhere? So how do you navigate those disagreements?
I think that, for me, I've always strived to be a very inclusive from a decision-making and leadership perspective. I was always in my earlier days, like quite introverted and, often wouldn't speak up, and always tried to create an environment, a platform to let folks that are underrepresented, whether it's because of personality or other issues, to make sure that we created a space that gave them comfort to speak up. And a lot of the best ideas come from, the quiet folks that don't speak up. And when you give them a platform, they can make amazing contributions. So that notion of, okay, at the end of the day, I am the one who is the most invested in this in terms of time. And so I am the primary decision maker and driver. And there's a clarity there of accountability and structure around decision making. So my approach is to keep people informed about important decisions and, ultimately listen and hear what their thoughts and perspectives are, and then to make the best decision that I'm able to make and let them know what that decision is and move forward with accountability for whatever that impact of that decision is going to be. So it's not consensus driven because of the nature of the structure and the kind of investment levels, time and money. But in terms of, the way that decisions are made about important things is really creating a platform for folks to voice their perspective and opinion, and then evaluate, make a decision, inform, take action.
You sort of touched on this a little bit, but one of the things that I always like to understand from the purpose of like digging deeper into the founding journey is a little bit how the company is thinking and how you're thinking about funding. Obviously, companies generally need money to exist and to pay people. So could you tell us a little bit about how you're funded in whatever detail you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah, sure. To date, founder bootstrapped, sweat equity, and some small grant funding. And yeah, I think that there was a bit of naivety on a lot of naivety on my part about, securing funding that, the first grant we applied for, we got. And it was a small grant, but I was like, oh, cool, this is going to be easy. And then, you get further into that and you realize, wait, this is not as easy as that. That was an anomaly. So, right now, that's where we're at in terms of, the funding journey is our own investments and time from folks that we built relationships with that see the promise in what we're working on, that are willing to work for deferred wages and equity exchange, and then some small grants, and we continue to go after those. And there will, need to be other avenues we open up, larger grants and things like that. And we're continuing to go after those.
I think out of curiosity, was the grant that you mentioned, is that Canadian Media Fund or is that another grant path?
A different grant program. And Canada Media Fund, I'll share this, whether you include this in the pod's up to you. We applied for prototyping fund and we scored 75 out of 100 in an environment where I'm going to guess the funding threshold would have been like, let's say 80, quite competitive. So we were not successful, but decided to keep going. But certainly, that was part of our plan was that would have been a big grant, like to a prototyping. I'm not sure if you know the numbers, but it's a $250,000 funding, and you've got to then match it with at least 25% of that on your own. So yeah, we didn't secure that, and it was kind of a challenging and somewhat frustrating experience in that the feedback that we got was not that helpful. And so we circled back and we met with the Canada Media Fund, and they were more helpful in the follow-up meeting. But, if you read through the feedback, you'd be like, oh, well, this is all really great feedback. There's very little in here that's negative. So, there's like a black box there about how the decisions that are made happen, and you take that feedback to the best of your ability and learn from it. I think it's, tremendous in Canada that we've got Canada Media Funds, and, hopefully it stays around for years to come. But it's certainly very challenging to secure Canada Media Fund grants.
Yeah, I know, especially with all the, just like every other funding source being very challenging right now, that means there is a lot of folks applying to Canada Media Fund right now, which in turn makes that much more competitive and, in some ways more of a black box because, you're competing with every other person who's putting in. And when there are more of them, right, like it all gets murky. I know that you sort of mentioned that you scored that initial grant funding and, perhaps took that as too much of a sign of things to come versus taking it as a upswing along the way. But really, when you thought about how you would approach funding the company, right, it sounds like bootstrapping and sweat equity was always part of the plan, and you pursued grants. It doesn't sound like you necessarily went, obviously the venture route or potentially even the publisher route yet. What's the biggest difference between how you thought the fundraising journey would be for this company sort of at the outset and then versus what's actually happened?
I thought that, again, partially because of that experience at first grant we applied for, we got, I thought that it would be easier. definitely was a sort of false positive there. And then, I think that I'd gotten to the stage where, because of a decade, more than a decade at EA, and, I spent like several years at Oracle Corp before that, I could work on a pitch for a couple of weeks because I was always driving something that was a little outside of the norm. The best work I've ever done all the way through my career was when people were saying, this is a terrible idea, you can't do it, and you shouldn't be doing this, and this is a waste of time. The best things I've ever done were in that environment, both rewarding for me personally, as well as outcomes and impacts on the project or business. And so in those environments, I could spend a couple of weeks formulating a business plan and have a, couple of conversations where I was able to secure funding for projects and initiatives that, had a monthly burn rate that's bigger than our entire game budget. So there's a little bit of like, oh, well, I must be really good at getting money. So it'll be really easy to get money in the games industry. And it's definitely been a lot harder than, I ever imagined it to be. Macroeconomic climate, competition, but also, there's a challenge in the industry right now that you've got to get your prototype, we'll call it, your playable, to the stage where it's pretty amazing before you're going to get taken seriously by a publisher. And that's a catch-22 right now, because if you're a solo dev, you can get there in many cases. And that's why there's a lot of great 1 to 3 person teams and a lot of publishers focused on those 1 to 3 person teams. And then on the other end of the spectrum, at that, like, okay, we're a team of 20 ex AAA devs. We're going to go form a studio. There is, as much as I think it's misguided, investment happening at those levels. But if you're in that, dead zone in between where it's like, well, we're a 4 to 12 person team making a game with a $2 to $3 million budget, that's really a dead zone right now. And that's, candidly, that's what we are, is that the ambition of what we have is not a solo project. And that's more challenging than I think any other part of the industry. And it's a bit of a trough right now in terms of like funding availability. But in terms of like flipping that around into, the sort of perennial optimism that you have to have in these circumstances, is that I go to that like kind of Wayne Gretzky thing, thinking in my absolute sadness of the Edmonton Oilers not winning a Stanley Cup last night, is that notion of, Gretzky's thing about like, go to where the puck is going to be. And if you think about the supply of funding into games that fall into that like AAA or AA type aspirations, that's going to create a shortage of content in that space in the next 2 to 3 years that to me represents opportunity. That, there's always going to be amazing indie games, but, at the really kind of smaller end. And then there's always going to be, a GTA 7, 8, 9 through the next millennia. But when I think about games like Jump Ship that recently launched a demo with a like 8 to 10 person team, probably a couple $1 million budget on the whole. I mean, that's an amazing game demo for a game that has so much promise. And I think that that's, where people are not putting money now, is going to create opportunities for that content that's more than a solo dev and, not a $100 million AAA studio, of which the vast majority of those will not achieve the kind of returns that the VCs need. So I think that, okay, let's look at the opportunity side of this, that if there's a shortage of funding supply, there's going to be a shortage of content supply. And if we can figure out how to get where we need to get to from a funding perspective, there's an even greater market opportunity than there would have been if there was active investment in that triple I, double A aspirational space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's always been this interesting balance across games for a long time of, the various categories and when and where the funding dries up for any one of them, and then a resurgence in that space. To your point, someone finding a way to get there and taking advantage of that opportunity will then create this sort of follow on, like if a double A thing breaks out, then suddenly there is funding for double A for a brief period of time, and then that dies off, and that sort of cycle repeats. So it's always about trying to figure out, how to take advantage of those moments where you can, and survive through the downdraft. And my condolences on your hockey team's loss.
I'm not an Oilers fan, but I am very proud Canadian, very elbows up Canadian at this moment in history, and was offset by the Abbotsford Canucks beating the Florida Panthers farm team 6-1 in the Calder Cup finals. So
there we go.
Glad to see that.
It all balances out. So on this journey that you've been on for the last couple of years, what do you feel like, on an individual basis? So like really for your own personal journey as a studio head, a studio founder, what has been your biggest struggle and how have you been approaching dealing with that struggle?
I think that, fundraising is, it's a bit of a cop out, but it's also, certainly the biggest struggle. And I think that, in terms of, dealing with it is to just keep figuring out ways to make progress and keep figuring out, how to think creatively about solving that problem. And so I'll give you an example that may or may not be useful to other people, but, and I'll keep it generic in terms of like, some specific company names, like having to be really, really creative and think of new and different ways to secure funding is been a driver for me. And one of the ways that we've looked at solving this is really creative deal structures and deal making. And one of those that this is kind of BC specific, but hopefully this might be helpful to other BC founders that may get this far through your podcast episode, is that there's a thing in BC called the Eligible Business Corporation Structure. And what EBC does is it gives BC-based investors investing in BC-based companies a 30% tax credit. So BC-based investor invests $100,000. Video games are a qualifying activity. You have to do a bunch of legwork to qualify. You have to have your ducks in a row and go through a degree of due diligence to qualify. But what it does is if just hypothetical numbers, keep the math easy, a BC-based investor invests $100,000, they get a $30,000 tax credit immediately. And so the way that we have thought about this is for us to look at partnering with studios in British Columbia that everybody is struggling right now in the industry, that we haven't finished, closing a deal like this yet, so may not come to fruition. But the way we looked at structuring this is that if we secure a certain amount of funding, we'll partner with a local studio. But the way we'll partner with them is that they will make an equity investment into our studio. They, as a result, get a 30% tax credit immediately. And then on top of that, because of the amazing work by people at DigiBC and other organizations, they've got a 25% tax credit on their costs. And so what we do is we take that equity investment and then we'll outsource work back to them. So they give us, let's just make up a number, a $500K equity investment. We go, okay, cool. We're going to outsource $600K worth of work back to you. And in that structure with the EBC tax credits and the IDMTC tax credit and potentially SHRED credits, there's actually no way for them to not come out ahead. And so those kind of creative structures are things that I've like had to learn about and then figure out, well, how do I package this up and make this something that is attractive to studios that have capital, don't have a huge amount of pipeline, can see the end of that capital in terms of like financial forecast, and are open to being thoughtful and creative about deal structures that provide mutual benefit. A small studio like ours, we want, a triple I, double A aspirations. We're not going to get there with the talent pool that we've got. So partnering in that way is something that, I've just continued to think about innovative and creative ways to solve that funding problem, and continue to educate myself about it, and then package that up as simply as possible, where someone on the receiving end of that says, this makes a ton of sense, and let's figure out a way to work together. Now, I won't claim that we've been successful at landing that, but what I will say is that we've been able to have conversations that are progressing that we would not have been able to have without getting some of those things in place that make it fiscally very attractive for studios that we could partner with.
When you think about, a lot of folks often talk about the role of a founder, and especially the role of a founder and CEO, as kind of a pretty lonely job in a lot of ways, because founder is not like any sort of normal job out there. And when you're also in the CEO seat, there's also a sort of an additional level of like weird role that not everyone can have empathy for. And also you sort of feel like you can't always share that sort of stress and perspective as openly when you're in that leadership spot. So as you think about your own journey and being in that seat over the last 2 years, what have been your primary support structures to sort of help maintain your optimism, your emotional health, the stress of it, right? Like what have you built for yourself to sort of support yourself on that journey?
I think self-care, physical and mental, has been, really critical for me. So like, folks that have known me for years would never think that I'm a guy that has a, very diligent mindfulness, meditation, and yoga regime that I practice every day. I exercise and work out every day. If there's points where I'm like, okay, I'm flagging here, I will go for a walk and get out in the woods, touch grass, I think is just super critical. So I think, as that, lonely journey goes, it's really down to yourself to figure out what do you need to do to get that support and make that happen. And for me, it's really been driven by mental and physical well-being and self-care related to those things to keep, healthy body, healthy mind to the best of my ability. Diet, again, super important from a self-care routine. So that's been my focus, is like I can control, certain things. And one of those is making sure that I'm trying to be a better version of myself today than I was yesterday, and work on those aspects of mental and physical well-being to as a sort of primitive that I think if you neglect, it's really easy to let the stress be overwhelming.
When you look on the horizon for both yourself as an individual and then, intrinsically also the company that you're involved with here, what's really the big things that you're thinking a lot about, right? Like not quite the what's keeping you up at night, but sort of, hey, in the 6 to 12 month horizons, what are the things that both for yourself and for the company, you're like, oh, I need to really think about how I do this. I really need to think about how I support myself here and there, right? Like, what are those big things that you're worried about?
I think for us, it is about figuring out a way to get the game that we want to make made at the quality level we want to make it. And that in today's world with a, startup studio with new IP, it's really, really hyper focused on getting a great, fantastic, playable demo. And what are the pieces that we need to put in place to get that playable demo into players' hands? And along the way there is an aspect of what we're doing. And I don't want to go too much like into the game aspect of what we're making, but one of the things that's a design principle in what we're doing is, one, to give back to society in a tangible, measurable way. And two is to bring the future of land stewardship and wildfire management to life in a game. And so around giving back to society, that's around forging partnerships. And we just, in the last week, nailed down a partnership with an amazing organization called the Wildland Firefighter Foundation that their mission is to take care of the families of firefighters that were killed in action, or a firefighter that was wounded in action and has gaps in the care and coverage. And they're just incredible people. The woman who started it was working in wildland fire, and she saw tons of injuries and fatalities and saw these like massive gaps. And she decided to start this foundation and like just get rid of all this bureaucratic, process and things that lead to multiple weeks, if not months, of people getting the aid or care they need. And her story impressed me so much that, like, from the earliest days of getting clear on the game we were making and how we wanted to contribute back to society, I knew we wanted to partner with them. And just last week, we solidified a partnership with them. So building those, kind of partnerships that are contributing back into society in a meaningful way. Again, it's obviously assuming we're going to be successful in making a game and building an audience. And then the other is bringing the future of wildfire management and land stewardship to life in our game. Again, more partnerships. So if you look at what's going on in wildfire innovation, there's a ton of companies that are doing things that when you look at what they're doing, you're like, oh, that would be really cool in a video game. So you may have seen like water bombers in Los Angeles, a very Canadiana-centric thing. That's an obvious one. That's like, well, we got to have, water bombers in our game, and we've got that roughed in. But then there's a lot more interesting things happening where, like, for example, a BC-based company called Firesworn they're taking these heavy lift drones and they're building technology to manage a swarm of 4 drones that semi-autonomously fight fires. And we met them, and they were inspired to build that technology because their family house burned down in a wildfire, and they left their jobs and said, we're going to go after this. And so we had this like really kind of common, values driven motivation to be in what we were doing. And so we're just in the process of creating a partnership agreement with them so that we could bring that kind of technology to life. And there are several others in that field of early stage VC investment in wildfire technology that we're having conversations about bringing that to life in our game, and then, showing these things to people and players, and hopefully providing some education and thought whilst at the same time having a really great time with, 4 of your friends battling the largest wildfires ever seen in a video game. But putting those partnerships in place that feed into contributing back to society, bringing the future of wildfire management to life in our game, and then exposing that through a really amazingly, hopefully fantastic public playable demo in 26 is the hyper focus for us.
I like to end the main section of the interview with an entirely unfair question, which is, given the experience so far, like if you let's go, 5-10 years in the future, let's not think about which way the wind blew for your current effort, but would you ever start another company again, knowing what you know now, having gone on this journey?
100%. It's no questions asked. Wish I'd done it sooner.
Do you think for yourself, like for this founding journey, you have such a clear, like, this is what I want to tackle in the world. Like, I want to have this impact in the world. Do you think that, if you were to start another company, you would need to find that again? Do you think you would just sort of like, this is you're going to keep founding companies in this space of the current motivation, or is it just like, hey, I had a friend who said that they were entirely unmanageable at this point, and so they would just start a company in the future because they could not ever be have someone else as a boss, right?
Yeah, I think that one of your really amazing guy that you had on, I think his name was Pavel, and you guys came up with that word ungovernable instead of unhirable. So I actually love that word, and I thought it was the apt choice given the nature of games that they're making. And what an amazing individual. I kind of think of myself as a bit ungovernable. And so, if we were to get, like, let's say, acquired, I'd probably focus on, I'll stay the 1 year, make sure that everything's good, but then I'm going to go off and do my next thing. And, I'm in the like later stages of my career. That's why this notion of like seeing the societal issues around me is important to think about. What kind of legacy am I going to leave in the world? Yeah, I'm a 15-year-old boy trapped in a middle-aged man's body. So that notion of, okay, well, what other thing could I do that's going to have a positive impact on society and leave some more positive legacy? There are so many of those things that excite and interest me that, right now I'm hyper focused on my love of games and a specific kind of personal experience around the wildfire crisis that motivates and inspires me. But if I was to, pause and reflect for a few months as I did prior to this, I'd find something else. And absolutely 100% would do it again, but would make sure that, I'd taken the lessons learned and apply those.
So now the way I sort of close out our conversation is with the introspection lightning round, where these really came from is a series of questions that I would propose when I was co-founder dating. So talking to potential co-founders, I would sort of give them these questions and we would both show up with our answers for one of our first conversations. And so we're just going to sort of lightning round, go through them. And we start with, what is your superpower?
I think that for me, the superpower or like a mantra that's aspirational for me is, from a leadership perspective, that my goal is to create space for the brilliance of others to shine, and constantly try to achieve that aspirational goal. And had some success with it, but definitely that notion of the power and the agency of others is something I strive to make a superpower. That's one. And then, another is systems driven thinking. I've always had this obsession with this kind of like systems driven structure, and that ability to, kind of visualize 5, 6, 7 different systems interacting has always been a strength in terms of going back to sort of the orchestration of, hey, we need these 3 or 4 things in place, and then these other 2 or 3 things can layer on top. And being able to think that way is, for a variety of reasons, something that has been a strength and served me well. That the more kind of messy and complicated things are, I can navigate some of those reasonably well.
Outside of those superpowers, what are your biggest strengths?
I think grounding in values and getting clear on those. I think that's comes with being older and more experienced, that the things that motivate and inspire me are, firmly rooted in some values that you get more and more clear on as you progress through life. And staying grounded in values is a strength for me in terms of how I treat people, how I want to be treated by people, and keeping that, authentic. I'm somebody that when I'm inauthentic, I really, really struggle. Like, so some of those things where it's like, I've got to be someone I'm not, I really suck at it. So I think that notion of like, just be me to the best of my ability to be the best version of me and constantly striving for that, whether it's a strength or not, it's something that I continue to work on to try to make it a strength.
And the flip side of that is, what are your big weaknesses?
So many. I'll speak of like two. So I am, like a lot of folks in our industry, I am neurodivergent. So I'm on the autism spectrum and also have ADHD, and those things can really, get in the way. They can also be superpowers. I think they contribute to, the ability to think in systems and in orchestration. But I really have to be mindful of those things and manage myself around those things, that when I don't consciously manage them, they can really get in the way. I've got two amazing kids that have similar dispositions, and they've taught me a ton about what that looks like, and made me more empathetic for them and myself in understanding it. So yeah, that neurodivergence, which can be a strength, but if I don't consciously manage it, can be a weakness. And my way of managing it is I'm not a huge fan of the pharmaceutical industry. I think that there's a lot of evil in that industry. So I have managed it through self-care, awareness, exercise, diet. And so, yeah, those things are a challenge. And then another is naivety. I tend to have this view that people are good and they're going to do the right thing. And that if I, do the same thing, try to do the right thing, that, that'll flow back positively. And that hasn't really been the case in some circumstances. I'll give you an example. Going into this, there were some folks that I thought that I would be able to rely on. And I had invested, like literally thousands of hours into their early stage founding journey to help them along when I wasn't in a position to join them, but was in a position to give them some mentorship. I spent thousands of dollars taking them on field trips that enriched their understanding of the game they were making. And, went back to them and said, hey, I'm forming a studio, and, I would like for you guys to maybe just give us a little boost on your social media channels because you've been fairly successful. And they're like, nah, I don't think so. And I was like, oh, I had totally assumed that we would have a sort of fair exchange of value here. And that has happened to me quite a few times where there's a naivety there about people doing the right thing or reciprocating favors that you've done for them. And that has caught me off guard a fair bit. I think naivety can be, something good. Go into things that other folks might not take on if you think too much about it. But also I do get caught off guard sometimes where those assumptions that people will reciprocate favors or whatever it might be don't come to fruition.
When you're under a lot of stress, what behaviors come out? I sort of call them your stress reaction behaviors, but like, if you're under intense stress, how do you sort of change?
I can feel my ears get warm. And I'm also, I have this skin condition called rosacea that, like, I'm an absolutely terrible liar because even like small little white lies, it's just like, you're beet red, dude. Like, yeah, I know. Okay, let's get back to the truth. So, stress reactors there are that, like, I can tell that, I'm heating up. And so, also manifests as like I'm flagging here, like I'm trying to solve something, I'm getting frustrated and it's not happening. And so to manage those things, again, for me, it's back to like self-care, like touch grass, go for a walk, get some exercise, spend time with my kids, and, focus on some of the more amazing things in life to be grateful for.
And the final question is, what things need to happen on a really regular basis professionally to keep you from getting into that stress reaction spot? I call them sort of upkeep needs. Like, what do you need to do on a regular basis professionally, like inside of work, or have happen inside of work, for you to stay more even keel?
Making progress is really the most important thing for me. Signs of progress, in terms of internally, okay, we said we're going to do these 3 things. 2.5 of them got done. I'm not going to focus on the half that didn't. Let's look at the 2.5 that did. And then, I think that it's an art form that is about public acceptance. So seeing signs in the business context from external, whether it's validation or whatever you want to call it, that recognition of progress being made is super important, that internally and externally that we're making progress and continuing to move forward and creating more opportunities.
Well, thank you so much for putting up with all of my questions and sharing your story. If anyone listening to the story really wants to reach out and learn more about your journey or follow up on something you mentioned, what's the best way for someone to get in touch with you?
The easiest to remember would be thisgameisfire.com, and hit the info link at the bottom there somewhere and send an email. That'll get to me, or connect with me on LinkedIn. It's Eamonn, Eamonn, last name's Glass, Glass. And as much as I find LinkedIn to be very heavily shitified, I think that pivot to an influencer-driven business model has been horrible for that platform. I still do make and accept and value connections on there.
Yep. Thisgameisfire.com is an amazing URL. I'm very impressed that you got it.
Yeah, I'm really worried that people will be like, this game is dire, dude. So we really got to work on getting there. But yeah, it's been an amazing journey, and this conversation with you is one of a memorable stop along the way. Feel humbled and privileged to be amongst the folks that you've had on this pod, and I thank you for doing it, because you're bringing a spotlight to folks that, for me, was thinking about that founder journey. I did this to like bit of practice, hopefully share something useful with other people. But thank you so much for putting the energy into this that you do, because the pods are fantastic and incredibly well produced, and your way of walking through interviews with people like me that tend to ramble is you got a gift for it. So thank you so much for that.
I appreciate that. And thank you again for spending time with us. Really enjoyed having you on.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hall, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founders support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.